our work package concentrated on the topic of women on the European labor market, and we were basically analyzing what has really changed in the position of women on the European labor market over the last 2 decades. What were the factors behind those changes? What were the differences across countries? Where did they come from? And all this was had the intention of singling out those factors that were behind those driving those changes in women's employment and activity rates, and trying to somehow guess, or rather come up with policy implications for the future. So what could be the solutions to improve women's situation on the labor market, and to increase their engagement on the labor market, so their employment rates, basically. The most important result we got was that women were the main factor that drove the European employment rate. So that if anything saved the Lisbon strategy, actually from that perspective, it was women who made it, simply because they were behind the most changes in the total employment or employment rates at the European level. That differed slightly across over time. So those changes were different in the 1990s and in the previous decades, so in the early 2000s, mainly because of the age groups. If you take into account the age perspective, in the 1990s, it was mainly women in the prime age that were increasing their labor market participation, labor market employment, whereas in the last decade, we, on the one hand, saw a very large increases in the employment of women aged 50 plus. So both those aged 50, 55 and those aged 55 till 65 or something. Whereas at the same time we saw decreasing employment rates among younger generations, younger cohorts. So young women, they enter the labor market later and later in their life. The other thing we found was how those results vary across countries. We saw large differences between the EU 15 countries and the new member states. The changes were different simply because employment rates of women, in particular older women, they are much lower in the new member states. We were looking at the different factors that drove those changes among women in different age groups. We found how much maternity policies matter for the youngest generations, how much different institutional settings relating to school to work transitions matter for the fact whether women manage to enter the labor market easily or whether that's more difficult. We also found very strong differences in the pension system design that is related to women's employment and women's labor market position at older age in general, but also their pension size, pension contributions and pension benefits in the future. And that's something that was one of the most important things that came up in our research results, how much the future pension systems will have to somehow incorporate the differences between working careers of men and women, how they change over the life cycle, so as to account for the career breaks, for example, and so as not to leave women with very, very low pension benefits in the future. We also looked at the gender wage disparities. That is something that has already been researched quite a lot, but we also found we were particularly interested in the different returns to flexible employment forms, so part-time jobs and to fixed-term contract jobs. How do they penalize or perhaps whether they offer wage premia for women working in those jobs. So, and we found very interesting results of strong heterogeneity of those results across countries and across different age groups. So, for example, in Poland, young women, well-paid young women, they turn to be better paid working part-time than those working full-time. But at the same time, fixed-term contracts, for example, penalize women strongly. So it's a huge pay disadvantage if you work on a fixed-term contract. Hungary, for example, turned out to be a different example. Also, the age patterns of gender wage gaps, they differ across countries. For example, in the new member states, the wage gaps tend to be much higher already at the beginning of their working career, which stands in contrast to the results that we got so far for the Western European countries, where at the entrance to the labor market, men and women are more likely to be paid similarly. So it's just a very brief summary of the main results we found. Yeah, they all were aimed at singling out the factors that stood behind the different labor market patterns of women at different age in different European countries. There are several policy implications that we list in our papers and in the policy brief we prepared as a result of the entire work done in the in the work package. However, the most important ones actually they are quite similar for women in all age groups. And again, something that is quite typical, but still, which is still a challenge in many of the European countries, are the institutional frameworks of childcare facilities and of different institutions that help to give care, so not only about childcare but also care to the elderly. It turned out that the problem with childcare and care on the elderly becomes a large obstacle to women's employment at different ages. So not only those women that have children at the young age, but also the older generations, those who retire earlier or as soon as it's possible for them, simply because they need to take care of their much older parents who are still living and who still need that care. So that's really something. A better access to formal childcare facilities is still the main challenge of improving future employment of women and of being able to fill in the gap in the labor force that will that is already visible on the European labor markets, but will become even more visible in the perspective of the next decade, given the population aging. The other solutions we come up, many of them policy proposals, policy implications, many of them relate to the involvement of men in of men in the childcare facilities and in housework in general. We still see the need of getting more men doing the jobs that are at the moment done by women. So we have a very nice working paper which describes those problems and differences across European countries, where the need for actually more emphasis is put on changing the stereotypes is still needed. Again, if we look at we also looked at lifelong learning participation rates and differences across between men and women in this respect. And what turned out is, again, the problem with working with the work-life balance is one of the main reasons behind lower participation rates in education at later stages in life, so non-formal education and informal education among women. And here we again see on the one hand, the need, once again, childcare facilities and all the institutional framework in this respect, but also the flexible working hours and more flexible approach to jobs and those different parts of the working life. So not only jobs, but also training and further education is of particular importance for women, simply because men, they somehow manage to get better here, and they have less problems, less difficulties in linking training and work. Finally, as I mentioned before, we came up with quite several implications for the pension system design and redesign, given the population aging and the need to extend the working lives of women. One of those relates to the need to have a better link between contributions and future pensions, so as to encourage women to stay longer on the labor market. On the other hand, there needs to be also a very wise, very well fine-tuned system of compensation for the career breaks related to childcare obligations and duties in the early life. Not too long and not too generous so as to discourage staying away from the labor market too long, but at the same time Some implemented simply because there is a need to compensate for that period in life for women, so as lower their risk of poverty in the future. So I guess that's the most important ones, but as I mentioned, there are quite many of them relating to women at different stages of their working careers, and all that can be found in our policy brief.